Welcome back. Thank you so much for joining us for this Q&A of Sink or Swim. I would just like to reintroduce our guest, director Su Friedrich. Su Friedrich has directed 23 films since 1978. Her credits include The Ties That Bind, Damned If You Don't, Rules of the Road, Hide and Seek, Gut Renovation, and I Cannot Tell You How I Feel. Her films have been featured in retrospectives at film festivals and major museums internationally, have been extensively written about, and have won numerous awards. Thank you, Su, so much for taking the time to speak with me today and for presenting your film as a part of AFIDOCS this year.
Welcome.
I will always remember, seeing this film for the first time. As you said, it still resonates with people. It's a very striking and unique experience to be seeing what feels like an entirely new cinematic language, with the layers and the contradictions and the way that you represent memory and trauma. I think maybe the best place to begin is one of the most striking contradictions is between the form and the content of the film. You have these kind of formal elements, this defined structure, but what we experience is intensely emotional. And the clearest example of that is going through the alphabet backwards in the chapter headers. So if you could just talk about how this concept came to you to do this and how you thought about structure as you were making the film.
Yeah. Well, I started out thinking I was going to make a narrative film because I'm interested in narrative, and Damned If You Don't had narrative elements, which I had made just before. And then I realized that was impossible. I had no money, etc. And then I started thinking about writing these sort of vignettes, these short stories. And I didn't yet know exactly how I would work with them. And at some point, and people always ask me this, and I never remember when it was, there was a point at which I thought, maybe I should do it based on the alphabet, which maybe had something to do with the Hals Frampton film, Zorn's Lemma. But maybe I should do it according to the alphabet because my father was a linguist and, he used the alphabet, which was interesting for me because it meant I had to generate 26 stories. So up until then, it had been very difficult I could think a lot of things, but to sit down and fashion them into a story was really difficult in the sense of being painful, aside from just the difficulty of writing. And suddenly I had to do 26 of them. So that was really good for me as sort of provoked me to keep going. And the other thing that happened is that in writing it at first, I was using the first person. I was talking about me and my dad. And that also was impossible. And so I decided to turn it into the third person, which really freed me, because even though it was me and him, I could still think about a girl and her father. And so just in terms of the sort of emotional aspects of, making something, both of those things were really helpful. But also because I was doing it with the alphabet, it started me thinking about the structure of it. And at some point, again, I don't know when, I thought of reversing it so that you kind of work your way, out the wrong way. And then in a way, since I wasn't doing a narrative and because I had made the kinds of films I made before, which in some cases used a certain amount of voiceover, like The Ties That Bind with my mother, I was kind of familiar with the idea of, using footage from real life and intercutting it with this voice. And so I just started thinking about how I would do that. And you might want to ask me about where the images came from, so I won't go on and on and on with that. But anyway, that's, but I would say with the sort of fundamental issue of dealing with extremely emotional material and having a really rigid structure is that I felt very grateful that part of my brain tended towards thinking about the structure in that way so that it could kind of control the emotional stuff from running rampant. I can't imagine just doing something kind of free form about something like what I talk about in the film. I needed to think, okay, this is this story. This is this story. What's going to go with this? How is the rhythm going to work?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this alphabet concept, the way that you're able to end it with this "tell me what you think of me," kind of tying into this theme of asking for acceptance, is really beautiful. But there are, as you mentioned, hearing the narrative through a child's voice is just one of the kind of many distancing elements in the film. You also have, you begin it with science and with Greek mythology, and it kind of takes a long time to get to the point where you realize this is your story, or even just that it could be your story. So if you could talk a little bit more about these kind of distancing elements and how you were kind of constructing them and developing them as you were creating the film.
Well, there aren't that many words that begin with Z, in a way, because my father had this connection to Greek mythology, and I did also through reading silly old Edith Hamilton. It kind of made sense to start with Zeus, and then of course it's about, procreation and etc. But the girl, you describe it as a distancing thing, and I guess it does function that way. But many times when people point to something that's done in my films, I have to give credit to my partner, Kathy Quinlan, because there have been so many times that I've been talking about what I'm going to do, and she'll say, well, that's really stupid, and she'll give me a suggestion, and I'll get really upset and say, but no, it's a really good idea. And then I'll realize that she's right. And so in this case, I had planned to use my own voice. I had made, a handful of films in The Ties That Bind, which was this interview with my mother. I didn't use my voice. When I spoke to her, I did, but then I reduced the questions down to scratched words on the screen. And so I kept not having myself directly in the films. And I thought with Sink or Swim that I really, at this point, absolutely needed to do that, that it would be sort of responsible or honest or whatever for me to do that. And Kathy said, no, it should be a girl. And I thought about it and realized that was true. And then it was very interesting in the audition, because we auditioned a bunch of girls, and one of them was really sweet, very kind of soft spoken. And then there was Jessica. And afterwards I said, oh, I really like so-and-so. And Kathy said, nah, it should be the other one. And I said, no, her voice is so sort of crisp and adult almost. And, and she said, that's the point. The material is really emotional. You can't have you can't add onto it. You can't overload it. And I thought, she's right. And then, hired Jessica, and I thought she did an incredible job. And the fact that her voice is so what it is, and it's funny to look back at something and realize all the decisions you make and how different something would have been. What if I had kept it writing me and my dad? What if it was this other girl? It wasn't the alphabet. It's kind of amazing, like all the things that add up to the film being what it is.
Yeah. And especially to have that the young girl's voiceover with the imagery and the way that these kind of intersections happen between the intersections and contradictions between the audio and the imagery. And so if you could go back, I think you were starting to talk about the imagery before, about how you kind of came up with this concept of incorporating home movies, found footage, and film footage, and where kind of some of these image associations came.
Yeah, and actually just the wonderful point that happened towards the end of the film was that the text says, when the girl became a woman, and you still have a girl reading it. So it did this great kind of loop of time or whatever it was, which wouldn't have happened if it was me. So the images, when I was talking with, I did this interview last year because of the 30-year anniversary, and the guy said, so, as a found footage film, and I said, hold on a minute, it's not a found footage film. And then I was talking to Scott McDonald, who knows my work inside and out. I've talked to him for like 35 years about my work, and he referred to it almost at the same time as a found footage film. And I was like, Scott, how could you say that? I love him. He's so smart. And he was like, oh, really? So that's the thing about Sink or Swim, is that virtually all of it was shot by me. The TV footage, obviously, but I shot that off the TV. I didn't shoot the egg and the sperm, but pretty much everything is my own footage. So in the question of sort of what went with what, you know, I sort of started slow, like, oh, I've got this part and maybe I should get footage of whatever it might be, you know, so I would go out and shoot it, you know, need roller coaster footage, go to Coney Island, you know, etc. There were some things that I used from prior film, the scene in the, you know, drowning in the bathtub scene with the kids at First Holy Communion was footage that I had shot for Damned If You Don't, you know, film about Catholicism, which I never used in that film, and somehow it worked really well in this. And so there was a lot of kind of filming with general ideas and sometimes filming with specific ideas in mind. And one example, and I was very reluctant to have things be illustrative of the text. You know, I didn't, obviously. But in the case of the ice skating rink story, I had put some other footage in there and it was just terrible. And I thought, okay, Sue, you actually have to go to an ice skating rink and find, you know, girls with their dads, like, you know, enough already. So there were some cases where I went to shoot and other cases where I just pulled from things or wandered and found things and worked out how they would work with it. So, you know, it's a mixture.
And in terms of actually putting it together with the audio, because you have this theme of the conflict between the memory and the present, and there are those conflicts that kind of occur with this voiceover narration.
Right.
What was the actual process of putting it together?
The process was that was the only year in, you know, 42 years of making a film that I didn't have to have a job because I had gotten something like a Guggenheim and a Jerome and something else. And so I didn't have to work and I could spend the entire year editing. It took a full year, probably even more, to edit on the flatbed. And really, I sort of went from section to section. I put together, I still do paper edits. I, you know, sort of wrote out all of the scenes. I wrote out all the kinds of images, like if a certain number of shots would go with a certain section, and I would have to figure out, particularly with cutting on film, if I even had enough footage to cover what was being said. And then a lot of times in the editing, I was trying to do something which I had started figuring out when I was doing the Ties That Bind, which was what I call it, it's a kind of sync sound, because if you have voiceover, you know, sort of intense voiceover, you can't just slap images on top of them because people, you know, people have different preferences. Some person is going to listen more, someone else is going to look more, and you don't want to lose people in the split. And so I started working with, you know, because of getting the images to really move with what was being said. You know, somebody says something loudly and a bird flies, or you know, anyway, there's just a lot of like subtle play in how the shots get cut together with the voiceover. So it was just a whole lot of that, trying over and over and over again. Yeah.
It's interesting to think about what could be a kind of tedious process doing this extensive editing work that you're doing, but also your work has been compared to a therapeutic process. Your
go on, lay it on me.
You know, this being kind of an investigation of your childhood traumas, but there's also these revelations about adult identity construction. And I wonder just kind of how much of this actually happens through the process of making the film, and how much of it is trying to depict kind of revelations you've already had or things you've already contended with.
Right. I don't think there was very much revelation through the making, except that at some point I showed the film, or maybe it was just the text, when I felt like it was finally written, because even the writing took forever, to my sister and brother. Mm-hmm. And my sister is a year older than me. My brother is 6 years younger. So their experiences with my father were different. Mine with my sister was closer to, you know, and I said, so what do you think? You know, am I telling the truth? Whatever. And it was really interesting because my sister said, well, you don't mention the fact that his sister drowned. You know, you don't mention this sort of watershed moment in his childhood. And I was really struck by that, that I hadn't even thought about it. And I kind of wrestled with the idea of including it. And at some point in including it, I thought, okay, it's good to do this because so much of the film was about me just bashing him, but he is a human being. And there was something in telling that story that gave a certain humanity to him, or just gave one some sense of maybe he was such an asshole, as a father, because he just never got over this thing that happened to him. So that was, that was something. But the reason I reacted the way I did at the beginning is because, often with the best possible intentions, no matter what the film is, it could be The Odds of Recovery, it could be, I Cannot Tell You How I Feel, whatever film I make that has something to do with, things I've experienced, people will ask me about art therapy. And it's just not the same thing, because I don't know, I've never done art therapy, but, I think it's somebody who's troubled and they're taught to use art, painting, watercolor, clay, whatever it is, to just express something that they're having trouble expressing. And so I don't think the goal is to make serious art, let's say. It's to use the sort of freeing processes of working with materials and images and objects to get at something that's a problem. That's not what making a film like this is, because I'm already very aware going into it that my purpose is to talk about those things. I'm not thinking like, oh, I wonder if I just start getting, if I get really stoned and start writing, I'll finally admit what it was like with my father. I was like, okay, now I'm ready to tell these stories, right? And also, even if you start in a kind of like, oh God, oh my God, this is gonna be a nightmare, but I have to do it. This sort of fear of facing the stories. At some point, you just have to get, busy with the craft. You have to think, okay, I scribbled out the story of the bathtub thing. Now I need to rewrite it probably 25 times until the language is good, until it's succinct and expresses what needs to be said. Good, done. Now I need to go on to the next one. So it's really this, long involved process of the craft of it. And the same thing with the editing. It wasn't just like, oh, these images, they feel so right with this. It was like, no, that is 4 frames off. That's 2 frames off, And so you get so far away from it being some sort of, curative thing or purgative thing or cathartic thing, whatever, that in the end, I could say, well, I really did say what I thought, but I was way beyond that at that point. And I think that can be said for, most people, since you're sort of focusing on personal documentaries, I think that can be said for anybody who's making this kind of work. If I think about work by other people who I know or whose work I've seen, I see it as a very crafted thing, not something therapeutic. That's like a tertiary benefit from doing it. So.
Yeah, and you mentioned, you celebrated the 30th anniversary of the film last year, and it's in the National Film Registry now, which is, it's an officially important film. What are kind of your thoughts on it now, 30 years later? How do you see it kind of fitting in with your filmography?
Well, I must say I feel really grateful that I made it. I think that was a lucky time. It took about 3 years to make, so I was like, glad that occurred to me, because it has been much loved and much shown, and we all want that for, if it doesn't matter how many films you make, if one of them is going to be the one that everybody has in their class and blah blah blah, then I feel very grateful. And it's also interesting with the passage of time, given the fact that when I made it, I was teaching at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee that summer. And so I had access to the university library. And this was like sort of before the internet. And I thought, oh, I wonder what kinds of films have been made about children going through divorce. And so I went and watched some of these educational films. There were maybe 2 of them. The language around the child's experience through divorce was virtually non-existent at the time. And which partly made me think, well, then I should do this. Also, the language, the discussion about the role of the father was really, really minimal then. If anything, it was spoken through the women who were talking about being mothers, because this was, sort of, let's say, earlier in the feminist movement, and women were already talking a lot about, their experiences parenting and all of that. But nobody was saying, but what about the dads? Let's really look at them. Nobody was doing that. And so it's weird now to show it, because there's 7, God knows how many books written about, children and divorce and this and that and the other. So there's sort of the general population has a lot more access to things which talk about the kinds of issues that are raised in the film. So it always makes me curious how people see it now, because they can think, oh, well, I saw 7 films last week on this subject, and it wasn't the case then. So, but that's the nature of things and time passing. So.
I don't think that's true. I don't think there's anything like this film.
Oh.
But I would love to just end this conversation with you talking about what you're doing now. You're still making films. You have these wonderful projects where you're supporting filmmaker William Greaves and this Edited By project. If you could just maybe speak a little bit about all of that.
Yeah, because when we were talking about editing, I wanted to jump in and say that, because about 2.5 years ago, I started working on a website called Edited By, everybody can find it, which is a sort of a website about women film editors, and there are 261 in there. It's an amazing document. And then last February, right as COVID hit, I was talking to Louise Greaves, and I looked at their website, and it was like from the 1930s, and it had VHS tapes. And I said, Louise, maybe the website needs to be updated. And I really loved Bill Greaves' work, and he had died about 6 years earlier. So I spent about 9 months last year making, and again, it's williamgreaves.com, easy to find, which has also, you can access a lot of his films through Vimeo, which was great because a bunch of them had not been available before. So those were 2 big projects. In the meantime, I had started to work on a book, which I hope to finish now, this summer and this fall, which is a sort of a document of a 6-month trip that I took through West Africa when I was 21 years old by myself, sort of starting in the north, down through the desert, across in a lot of different countries. And I took photographs and stuff. So that book, and I'm kind of working on a film, but I don't know what it is yet. I'm sure I'll make another film.
Well, I look forward to seeing what it turns out to be. Thank you so much for being here, Sue, for allowing us to celebrate this film as a part of AFI Docs. And thank you to everyone in the audience for being here today. Please visit our website at docs.afi.com for more opportunities to interact with these films, audiences, and filmmakers, and of course, to see more films. Sink or Swim is available to screen for free throughout the remainder of the festival. We would love to hear from you on social media at #AFIDocs.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.